But right now, we have new information breaking about the Nancy Guthrie disappearance case in Tucson, Arizona. Of course, she's the 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie, who's been posting emotional videos on Instagram, and now the family offering $1 million reward in this case that has now dragged into...
The suspect who walked onto Nancy Guthrie's porch may have believed the camera was the only witness that mattered. That is why, according to the provided material, he appeared to go straight for it. He wore a mask, he wore gloves, he moved carefully through the dark, and within moments the doorbell camera was disrupted. But this case may not turn on the camera he tried to disable. It may turn on what he accidentally left behind while trying to do it. Because homes remember things differently now. Motion systems log movement. Phones lose connection at exact moments. Digital systems keep fragments people never expect investigators to recover. And human beings, no matter how careful they think they are, leave traces of themselves behind. That is what makes the Nancy Guthrie case so unsettling. Nancy was 84 years old. She lived a quiet life in Arizona. According to the timeline described in the provided material, she was dropped off at home late at night. By morning, she was gone. Then came the details investigators reportedly began piecing together. A disabled camera, a motion alert after the camera went dark, a pacemaker that reportedly disconnected from Nancy's phone during the early morning hours, and blood found outside the home. From that point on, the investigation became about more than a disappearance. It became about evidence. Not dramatic theories, not internet rumors, actual traces that may still connect someone to that porch. And that is where the case becomes complicated. Because DNA is not instant proof. A sample can be partial, mixed, damaged, difficult to separate. It can move through multiple laboratories before investigators even know whether it is strong enough for genealogy analysis or database comparison. Yet according to the materials surrounding this case, that process is exactly what has been happening for months. 5 laboratories, questions involving local investigators and the FBI, a possible unknown DNA profile, and growing speculation that the suspect may have made far more mistakes than he realized. But before we get into the DNA itself, we need to understand the night Nancy disappeared, because the timeline of that night may explain why investigators still believe the person responsible left something behind that could eventually lead to a name. According to the provided material, the timeline investigators focused on begins with what looked like a completely normal evening. Nancy Guthrie had dinner with family. Later that night, she was reportedly dropped off at her home. Nothing appeared unusual. No emergency calls. No visible signs that anything was about to happen. Then, sometime after 1:40 in the morning, the situation changed. Investigators say a masked individual appeared near Nancy's front door. The person was reportedly carrying a backpack and wearing gloves. More importantly, the individual seemed aware of the doorbell camera almost immediately. That detail matters, because it suggests this was not random movement through the neighborhood. Whoever approached that house may have already known surveillance existed there. But the camera itself is only part of the story. According to the material, even after the device was disrupted, motion systems still logged activity near the property. That means investigators may still have a timeline of movement, even if parts of the video were lost. And then came one of the most discussed moments in the entire case, at approximately 2:28 in the morning. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker reportedly disconnected from her phone. To many people following the investigation, that timestamp became deeply unsettling. Not because it explains everything, but because it may represent the last known digital trace connected to Nancy before she vanished. Then came the discovery the next morning. Nancy failed to appear for an online church service. Concern grew quickly. Family members went to the home, and outside, investigators reportedly found blood evidence on the porch that changed the tone of the case immediately. Because now the question was no longer whether something happened. The question became how much evidence the person responsible may have left behind while it happened. And according to several experts mentioned in the provided material, that may be where the suspect made the biggest mistake of all. The person seen near Nancy Guthrie's home appeared prepared in some ways. According to the provided material, the suspect wore a mask, gloves, and carried a backpack. The individual also appeared to move directly toward the camera, suggesting at least some planning before arriving at the house. But several experts mentioned in the case believe the suspect may have made critical mistakes anyway. One of the biggest involves simple human behavior: Former investigators reportedly pointed out that while the suspect covered much of his appearance, he may not have fully protected against biological evidence. A person can leave traces through touch, movement, skin cells, hair, saliva, or contact with surrounding surfaces without even realizing it. And in this case, investigators were not only looking at one possible source of DNA. According to the provided material, they reportedly collected multiple forms of evidence from the scene, including blood evidence, trace material, and a hair recovered inside the home. That is where the investigation became far more difficult than most viewers realize, because DNA is not always clean. Sometimes a sample contains material from more than one person. Investigators refer to this as a mixed sample. Instead of one clear profile, forensic analysts may be trying to separate overlapping genetic material piece by piece. Imagine trying to isolate one voice in a crowded room where several people are speaking at the same time. That is why some DNA evidence can take weeks or even months to process properly. According to public discussion surrounding the case, some samples reportedly produced partial or difficult results early on, and that may explain why multiple laboratories eventually became involved. But the growing attention around the case was not only about the science. It was also about where the evidence was being sent, who was handling it, and whether valuable time may have been lost during the earliest days of the investigation. And that is where the Nancy Guthrie case stopped looking like only a forensic mystery. It also became a controversy as public attention around the case intensified. Another issue began drawing scrutiny alongside the DNA itself: the timeline of the investigation. According to statements discussed in the provided material, questions emerged about when federal investigators became fully involved and where critical evidence was initially sent for testing. Reports surrounding the case describe how some DNA evidence was first processed locally before additional testing was later conducted through private laboratories. Eventually, the evidence reportedly reached the FBI laboratory in Quantico. That sequence became controversial. Some officials suggested the FBI could have analyzed the material earlier. Local authorities pushed back, stating they acted based on operational needs and existing procedures. Public statements from both sides created the impression of tension during the earliest stage of the investigation. And in a case like this, timing matters. Not because DNA disappears overnight, but because the first days after a disappearance are often the most important for preserving evidence, identifying leads, and building investigative momentum. Still, forensic experts mentioned in the provided material also stress something important that often gets lost online. A difficult DNA sample does not automatically mean investigators failed. Some evidence simply takes far longer to process, especially if the sample is partial, mixed, or damaged. Different laboratories may also specialize in different techniques. One facility may focus on rapid testing, while another may have more advanced genealogy capabilities. That is why the phrase 5 laboratories sounds dramatic, but may also reflect how complex modern forensic work has become. And eventually, the conversation around the case shifted toward one specific possibility: genetic genealogy, not traditional database matching, something much more advanced. Because according to the discussion surrounding the investigation, the unknown profile reportedly did not produce a clear Cody's match. That raised an uncomfortable possibility for investigators. What if the person responsible had never been arrested before? What if the DNA belonged to someone completely outside the criminal database system? That is where genealogy changes everything, and it may also explain why investigators still believe the evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home could eventually lead them to a name. Genetic genealogy sounds futuristic, but the idea behind it is surprisingly simple. If investigators cannot identify a person directly through a criminal database, they may try to identify them through relatives instead. According to the materials surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case, that possibility became increasingly important. Once reports suggested the DNA profile did not produce a clear Cody's match, and that changes the direction of an investigation completely. Traditional DNA databases compare evidence against people already inside the criminal justice system, but genealogy works differently. It looks for partial family connections through ancestry-style databases where people voluntarily submit DNA for heritage research. That means investigators may not need the suspect himself to be in a database. A distant cousin could be enough to begin building a family tree. From there, investigators reportedly compare ages, locations, relationships, and timelines until the pool becomes smaller and smaller. But there is a major complication in this case. According to forensic experts discussed in the provided material, genealogy works best with a clean DNA profile. Nancy Guthrie's case reportedly involves more difficult evidence, including mixed or partial samples. That may be one reason the process has taken so long. And yet, several experts still appear convinced the forensic evidence matters deeply, not just because of the hair reportedly recovered inside the home, not just because of possible trace DNA, but because investigators also reportedly isolated an unknown blood profile connected to the scene. That detail changed how many people viewed the investigation. Because blood is different. If the unknown blood truly belongs to the suspect, it raises the possibility that Nancy fought back hard enough to injure the person responsible. And if that profile is strong enough for genealogy analysis, the investigation could shift very quickly. Still, there is another question hanging over this entire case. Was the person seen near Nancy's home actually the one who planned everything? Or was he only the visible part of something larger? That possibility may explain why some investigators and analysts began discussing a theory known as a wrench attack. The term wrench attack does not come from traditional kidnapping investigations. It comes from a very different world. The idea is simple and disturbing at the same time. Instead of breaking into encrypted accounts or sophisticated financial systems digitally, a criminal targets a real human being connected to money, influence, or access. The pressure is applied physically, while the real organizer may remain far away from the actual violence. According to analysts mentioned in the provided material, some aspects of the Nancy Guthrie case caused investigators to at least consider whether something like that framework could apply here. Not as a confirmed conclusion, but as a possibility worth examining, because the case appears to contain two very different levels of behavior. On one side, there are signs of planning. The suspect reportedly knew where the camera was. The timing of the approach appeared deliberate. The individual arrived prepared with gloves, a mask, and a backpack. Some experts believe the person might also have known details about Nancy's routines and the family connected to her. But on the other side, there are also signs of mistakes. The suspect reportedly exposed part of the wrist area while moving near the camera. Experts suggested biological traces may have been left behind, and the overall behavior, according to some former investigators, did not fully resemble a highly trained professional. That contradiction matters, because it raises a difficult possibility. What if the person physically seen at the house was not the person who designed the entire plan? Some analysts discussed in the provided material suggested the visible suspect may have been a lower-level participant carrying out instructions rather than the central organizer. Again, there is no public evidence confirming that theory, but it changes the way many people think about the investigation. Because if multiple people were involved, then DNA from the porch may identify one person while still leaving larger questions unanswered. And that may be why investigators appear to be treating every trace of evidence so carefully. The blood, the hair, the digital timeline, the movement logs, the vehicle reportedly seen near the area. Each detail may not simply identify what happened. It may help investigators understand how many people were involved, what role they played, and whether the visible suspect was only one part of a larger story. And after more than 100 days, that may be the hardest reality in the entire case. The public is waiting for one answer, but investigators may still be trying to understand what question they are actually solving first. There is another reason this case continues to hold public attention. Long after the initial headlines faded, the evidence may still be evolving. In many investigations, the public assumes forensic work happens quickly. A sample goes into a lab, a match appears, and an arrest follows. But real cases are rarely that simple, especially when the evidence itself is difficult. According to experts discussed in the provided material, modern forensic investigations often move in stages. First, investigators try to determine whether a sample is usable at all. Then they attempt to separate profiles if the DNA is mixed. After that comes comparison testing, database work, and potentially genealogy analysis. And each step can introduce delays, especially when multiple laboratories become involved. That is why several experts warned against assuming silence means investigators have no direction. In fact, some of the most important work in cases like this happens quietly, behind closed doors, long before the public hears anything official. At the same time, experts also cautioned against the opposite mistake, assuming DNA automatically guarantees a solution. Because forensic evidence is powerful, but it is not invincible. Defense attorneys examine chain of custody. They challenge collection methods. They question contamination risks. handling procedures, and interpretation. In other words, evidence does not only need to point towards someone, it has to survive scrutiny later. And that may explain why investigators appear to be moving carefully with every public statement connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. But beneath all the forensic discussion, there is still a very human reality at the center of this story. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Her family is still waiting. And somewhere, according to the evidence discussed publicly so far, there may be a person living with the knowledge that traces from that night could still lead investigators back to them. A movement log, a strand of hair, a blood sample, a digital timestamp. Something small enough to overlook in the moment, but significant enough to matter months later, because one theme appears again and again throughout this case. Human beings leave traces behind, even when they believe they were careful. And if investigators eventually identify the person connected to those traces, the breakthrough may not come from one dramatic clue. It may come from several small details finally connecting together in the right order. At this point, the Nancy Guthrie case becomes larger than one investigation. It becomes a reminder of how modern evidence works, how public attention shapes a case, and how easy it is for speculation to move faster than facts. Because throughout this investigation, there have been two very different stories unfolding at the same time. One story exists online. Rumors, theories, assumptions. People trying to decide guilt before investigators have publicly confirmed answers. But the other story exists inside laboratories, case files, forensic reviews, and timelines built piece by piece through evidence. And those two stories are not always the same. That distinction matters, because responsible attention can help a case. Public awareness can generate tips, preserve pressure, and keep investigations active in the public mind. But certainty without evidence can also damage real people, distort facts, and push discussion away from what investigators can actually prove. That is why the most important lesson in this case may not only be about DNA, it may be about patience. The patience required to separate possibility from proof. The patience required to let evidence develop before conclusions harden. And the patience required for families who continue waiting while the investigation moves far more slowly than the public wants. According to the material surrounding the case, investigators still believe the forensic evidence matters. The unknown profile reportedly remains important. Genetic genealogy may still be underway, and the physical and digital traces from that night continue to shape the direction of the investigation. But no matter where the case eventually leads, one reality already stands out clearly. The suspect did not erase everything. The camera may have gone dark, but movement was still logged. The timeline still survived. Evidence was still collected. And somewhere inside those fragments, investigators may still be assembling the answer piece by piece. That is why the Nancy Guthrie case continues to matter. Not because of internet theories, not because of sensational headlines, but because it shows how even a carefully planned act can leave behind tiny details that refuse to disappear. And in modern investigations, those details sometimes speak louder over time, not quieter. If you followed this case seriously, share your thoughts respectfully below. Which detail do you believe investigators consider most important right now? The blood evidence, the digital timeline, or the possibility of genealogy identification? Because in cases like this, the smallest unanswered question can eventually become the detail that changes everything. And maybe that is the hardest part of the Nancy Guthrie case to accept. Not that investigators have no evidence, but that the evidence may still be incomplete. Somewhere between the camera footage, the motion alerts, the blood evidence, the possible DNA profile, and the unanswered timeline, investigators appear to believe there is still a path forward. A difficult path, a slow path, but still a path, because cases like this are rarely solved in one dramatic moment. More often, they are solved quietly. One lab result leads to another. One overlooked detail gains meaning months later. One inconsistency suddenly fits into a larger pattern investigators could not fully see before. And according to the material surrounding this case, that may be exactly where things stand now. The public sees silence and assumes nothing is happening. But forensic investigations do not always move at the speed of public attention. Sometimes the most important work happens when nobody outside the investigation can see it. And that matters here because Nancy Guthrie is not just the center of a mystery. She is a real person whose family continues waiting for answers, waiting for clarity, waiting for the moment when evidence becomes enough to explain what happened that night. Whether that answer eventually comes from genealogy testing, digital evidence, witness information, or a mistake the suspect never realized they made, one reality continues to stand out in this case. The person responsible may have planned for cameras, they may have planned for darkness, they may even have planned for panic, but according to everything discussed around this investigation, they may not have planned for how many traces human beings leave behind without noticing. A movement log, a strand of hair, a timestamp, a blood sample, tiny fragments that, on their own, may seem insignificant, but together they can begin forming a story, and sometimes that story becomes impossible to outrun. That is the real message of this case. Not that technology solves everything. Not that DNA guarantees justice, but that truth is often built slowly, carefully, and piece by piece through details people once believed would disappear forever. And if the evidence collected in the Nancy Guthrie case eventually leads investigators to the person responsible, the breakthrough may not come from one massive revelation. It may come from the smallest detail, finally connecting with all the others. Until then, the case remains active, the questions remain open, and the search for answers continues. Because Nancy Guthrie's story is still unfinished.